It's 1977, and a man went into his mother's attic, simply looking for old photographs. I'm sure he was puzzled when he found 60,000 of them. His mother had just passed away, and for most of his life, he'd known her as, and I'm quoting him directly, a useless drunk, demanding, unpredictable, throwing dramas at every possible thing. But what he found in those boxes told a whole different story. Buried under decades of dust were some of the most important photographs of the 20th century. These were images from inside Nazi concentration camps, the liberation of Paris, the London Blitz, and one photograph in particular, a woman washing the dust of Dachau off in Adolf Hitler's personal bathtub on the exact day he ended his life by his own hand. That woman was his mother. Her name was Lee Miller, and the story of how she went from Vogue supermodel to war photographer to then burying it all in an attic while her own son had no idea who she really was poses a question most of us avoid. What is the cost of witnessing, and what do we do with the truth once we've seen it? Before we go any further, I want you to think about what I'm about to say. We live in an age of being seen, but there's a difference between being seen and seeing, between being the subject and being the witness. Lee Miller spent the first portion of her life being looked at. She was, by every account, staggeringly beautiful, stunning. She was one of the most photographed women of her generation. Here's the thing though, she didn't want to be the picture. She wanted to take the picture. And that choice to stop being the object and become the eye would lead her to places most people couldn't even fathom. Not without a price, as it would cost her everything. Here's what I want to explore. What does it mean to truly witness something? Not to simply glance and look away frivolously, but to see it, document it, carry it with you. And what happens to a person who forces themselves to look at what everyone else turns away from? Because Lee Miller looked. She looked at things that would break most people. And she came home, buried the evidence, and never spoke of it again. This is the story of what she saw, why she hid it, and what her son discovered decades later in a dusty attic. Here's why this story matters to me and why it should matter to you as well. In my experience, while in the military and throughout life, there are people who look and people who look away. When situations become challenging and reality becomes ugly, most people find a reason to turn away. It's only human nature at times to simply survive and not look back. These situations can be as small as looking away from the needle when a nurse is drawing blood, or as big as being so afraid of potential circumstances in your own mind that you psych yourself out. But then there are some people who don't look away. Some people force themselves to witness, to document, to remember, even when it costs them and exacts a toll that is to be determined. I think about what goes into that decision or instinct. What does it take to keep your eyes open, observing, documenting, when everything in you wants to close them? And what happens to you afterward once the dust settles? Lee Miller kept her eyes open, and then she spent the rest of her life trying to forget what she saw. That tension between witnessing and surviving, that's what made me really want to dive into her story. Her story begins in 1926, Manhattan. She's a 19-year-old woman named Elizabeth Miller, Lee to everyone who knew her. She steps off a curb straight into traffic, and as fate would have it, a man grabs her arm and pulls her back, effectively saving her life. That man was Condé Nast, the founder of Vogue magazine. Now here's where it gets interesting. Some historians believe Lee knew exactly who Condé Nast was, and that stepping in front of traffic might have not been an accident at all. Regardless of whether it was luck or strategy, the result was the same. And within months, Lee Miller was on the cover of Vogue. By 1927, she was one of New York's most sought-after models, the face of the jazz age. She was everywhere, photographed by the most famous fashion photographers of the era. Her face was on magazine covers, in advertisements, in galleries. But here's what most people didn't know. Lee Miller didn't want to be looked at. What she wanted was to look, to be the observer. Lee learned the mechanics and fundamentals of photography from her father, but it was a complicated inheritance. He was her closest ally, yet he documented her in ways that shattered normal boundaries between parent and child. She realized early on that the person holding the camera holds the power. In front of the camera, you're the object. You're defined by someone else's vision. Behind the camera, you control the frame. You decide what gets seen and what gets hidden. For Lee, that power mattered more than being beautiful. So, in 1929, she did something bold. She sailed to Paris with one goal: find the surrealist artist Man Ray and become his student. When she tracked him down at a bar, he told her he didn't take students and was leaving for the summer. Her response to that dismissal: so am I. And she went with him. For 3 years, Lee Miller lived with Man Ray as his student, collaborator, lover, and equal. Together, they developed the technique of solarization, which is that haunting effect where light and dark reverse, creating halo-like outlines. But more importantly, she learned to see differently. Surrealism taught her to find meaning in the strange, the disturbing, the things other people looked away from. That training would prove more valuable than she could have imagined. By the early 1930s, Lee had established herself as a serious artist. She had her own studio in New York. She exhibited alongside the greatest names in modern art. She was friends with Picasso, who painted her portrait 6 times. Then, in 1939, she followed a new love, the British surrealist Roland Penrose, to London. And that's when the world caught fire. September 1939, Germany invades Poland. Britain declares war. Lee Miller's friends and family begged her to come to America, where it was safe. She refused to turn her back. Instead, she picked up her camera. At first, she worked for British Vogue, photographing fashion and lifestyle during wartime. Fashion for factories, articles about making do with rationing. She later said it felt pretty silly to go on working for a frivolous paper like Vogue during a war. Good for the country's morale, she said, but hell on mine. She wanted to do more. She wanted to document what was actually happening. When the Blitz began, Germany's relentless bombing campaign on London, Lee photographed it, but not like a news photographer, like a surrealist. She captured the wreckage as sculpture, fire masks that made people look like aliens. She found strange beauty in destruction, not to glorify it, but to make people look at it. In 1942, Lee got what she wanted: official accreditation as a U.S. Army war correspondent through Vogue. She was one of the only women with that status. But there was a catch. The military didn't want women in combat zones. She was supposed to cover nurses, support roles, stories considered appropriate for a female correspondent. Lee had her foot in the door, and she had other plans. In 1944, she arrived in Normandy just after D-Day. She was sent to St. Malo, France, to cover what was supposed to be a liberated town. That wasn't the case. It was still under siege. Instead of retreating, she stayed. For 5 days, she was the only journalist on the front lines. The military was furious. They put her under house arrest and threatened to revoke her credentials. But they didn't. Her photos were too powerful. The work spoke for itself and was undeniable. From there, she moved with the Allied forces across Europe, where she photographed the liberation of Paris. She also ran to check on her old friend Picasso to make sure he was safe. Yet still, she was headed somewhere darker. In April 1945, Lee Miller and fellow photojournalist David Sherman arrived at Buchenwald, and almost immediately after, Dachau. They were among the first journalists to enter liberated camps. What they saw there broke language. It was a reality no human being should ever have to witness, let alone endure. Piles of bodies stacked like cordwood, skeletal survivors barely breathing, the stench of death thick, so overwhelming that Lee later said it clung to her for years. But Lee didn't recoil. She climbed inside of the cattle cars that had transported prisoners to their deaths. She photographed the corpses and from inside out, forcing the viewer to stand where the victims had stood. She photographed the crematoriums, the mass graves, the faces of survivors etched with the agony of what had transpired. And then she did something that would define her legacy. She sent a telegram to her editor at British Vogue, Audrey Withers, and it read, "I implore you to believe this is true." I can feel the desperation in those words. Imagine the burden. She had just witnessed some of the worst things human beings had ever done to each other. And her first instinct wasn't to process it, wasn't to look away. It was to make sure the world believed it. Because she knew people would want to deny it. She knew they would call it propaganda or exaggeration. So she begged them to look. Now Lee faced another fight on another front. She sent the negatives back with that telegram. She was battling the world's refusal to accept that such evil was possible. British Vogue flinched. They wouldn't run the worst of it, but American Vogue didn't blink. They published the photographs under the headline, "Believe It," and there they were. Images of mass graves sitting opposite advertisements for lipstick and luxury. It was jarring. It was grotesque, and it was exactly what Lee demanded. She forced the women reading Vogue in their comfortable living rooms to look at the ashes of Europe. She made sure that this time they couldn't turn the page. But Lee couldn't turn the page either. On April 30th, 1945, the same day that Adolf Hitler ended his life by his own hand, in Berlin, Lee Miller arrived at his private apartment in Munich. She was still covered in the mud and filth of Dachau. She carried the scent of the camps on her clothes, in her hair, on her skin. And she walked right into the dictator's bathroom. She needed to wash it off. Now, due to copyright restrictions, I can't show you the full image here. But I want you to pause this video, search for Lee Miller bathtub, look at it carefully. What you'll see is her combat boots standing on the pristine white bath mat. Those boots were still caked with mud from Dachau, the concentration camp she had documented that same morning. She deliberately left them there, contaminating Hitler's sanctuary with evidence of his crimes. A portrait of Hitler sits on the edge of the tub watching, and there represents Lee, washing the filth of the camps off her body in the monster's own water. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a joke. It was a deliberate act of defiance. She later said, "I washed the dirt of Dachau off in Hitler's own tub. But when I look at that image, I don't just see a bath. I see the end of an era. The Führer's dead, his grand plan is broken, and an American woman who had just witnessed the full horror of what he perpetuated and created is bathing in his most private space. It's triumph and trauma in the same frame. Victory and violation, an exorcism performed in a bathtub. That night, she slept in Hitler's bed, and then she kept moving, kept photographing, kept witnessing, as if stopping would mean the images might catch up with her. After the war ended, Lee Miller didn't go home immediately. She kept photographing the aftermath, the refugees, the graves still being dug. It was as if she was afraid that if she stopped, the horror would catch up to her. But eventually, the momentum ran out. When Lee finally returned to England, something was broken. The fearless woman who had stared down the worst of humanity became withdrawn. She suffered severe depression. She drank heavily. She was, by all accounts, difficult to be around. Volatile, unpredictable, sometimes cruel. What we now recognize as PTSD wasn't understood then. There was no name for the ghost she was carrying. No treatment, just the expectation that at that time, you keep a stiff upper lip and you move on. She married Roland Penrose in 1947, had a son, Anthony. They bought a farmhouse in the English countryside called Farley Farm. And then Lee Miller, one of the most important war photographers of the 20th century, put her camera down. She packed 60,000 negatives into cardboard boxes, she shoved them into the attic, and she never spoke of the war again. Instead, she reinvented herself one last time. She became a gourmet cook. But this wasn't ordinary cooking. It was surrealist cooking. Blue fish, pink cauliflower, elaborate dinner parties where the food was as strange and as beautiful as her art had once been. It's tempting to see the cooking as just a hobby, but I think it was something else. After years of documenting death, the smell of corpses, the mud on her boots from horrific places, she turned to something that engaged all of the senses in the service of life, creating instead of documenting, nourishing instead of witnessing. The cooking was her way of reclaiming her senses from the assault of what she'd seen, but the silence came at a cost. Her son, Anthony, grew up with no idea of who his mother had been. He knew her only as a difficult, alcoholic woman who struggled to catch a train without it becoming a crisis. They fought constantly. He didn't understand her darkness. She couldn't explain it. She died of cancer in 1977 at 70 years old. Her secrets went with her, or so everyone thought. Shortly after Lee Miller died, Anthony Penrose went into the attic of Farley Farm. His wife, Susanna, had found a stash of papers in the shadows and told him he needed to see them. He sat on the stairs and read what she'd brought down. Then he read it again and again. It was a manuscript, 26 pages, describing the siege of St. Malo, a battle Lee had witnessed and documented against direct military orders. The prose was vivid, haunting, professional, and Anthony had no idea who had written it. He took the pages to his father. Roland Penrose didn't say a word. He just pulled an old issue of Vogue off the shelf and pointed to Lee's byline. his mother had written it. That discovery cracked the dam. They found more boxes, then more, 60,000 negatives, manuscripts, letters, contact sheets, even a brass knuckle duster with her name engraved on it. An entire life hidden under the dust. In that moment, the mother he thought he knew, the difficult, unpredictable, alcoholic, vanished, and a stranger took her place. Anthony described the realization like this: this person who I had dismissed as being a useless drunk now had other dimensions to her, which I was totally astonished by. It had never occurred to me that her career was so distinguished and so varied and so absolutely groundbreaking. I wished I had known her better and understood her better. Then maybe we would not have wasted so much time fighting. That is the tragedy of silence. For his entire life, Anthony knew his mother only as a broken woman. He had no idea she was one of the most vital eyes of the 20th century. No idea she had forced the world to look at its own darkness. She'd never told him. She buried it all in cardboard boxes and carried the weight alone. But the attic didn't just hold her work. It held answers to why. As Anthony pieced together his mother's history, the timeline of her trauma extended far back beyond the war. He learned that at 7 years old, Lee had been severely violated by a family acquaintance. It left her with a disease that was at the time a mark of deep social shame. And he had to reconcile the truth about his grandfather, the man who taught Lee photography, but also used her as a nude subject throughout her childhood. Anthony said learning all of this was like being kicked in the gut by a mule. But it finally made sense. The restlessness, the fierce need to control the frame, the drinking, the silence. The woman who had witnessed the worst of humanity had already survived the worst before she'd ever picked up a camera. Lee Miller's photographs now hang in major museums around the world. Kate Winslet played her in a biopic. Her name is finally known. But for decades, she was forgotten by choice. She buried her own legacy because the weight of what she'd seen was too heavy to carry while also trying to live. And that is what I keep coming back to. We never really know what someone has survived. Anthony Penrose looked at his mother and saw a difficult, broken woman. He saw the wreckage, but he never saw the storm that caused it. He didn't see the woman who climbed into cattle cars at Dachau, the woman who bathed in Hitler's tub on the day he died, the woman who begged the world to believe the unbelievable. Lee Miller's life asks us a brutal question. What is the cost of witnessing? She chose to look at things most people can't imagine. She forced herself to document the truth when every instinct in her body must have screamed to turn away. And then she spent the rest of her life trying to numb the memory of it. Is that tragedy, or is that the ultimate price of heroism? I don't think there's an easy answer, but her story's a reminder. We should never assume we know the full measure of a person based on their worst days. Everyone is carrying something. Some people are carrying horrors we can't even comprehend. And sometimes, the people who look the most broken are the ones who once had the courage to keep their eyes open when the rest of the world looked away. This is why I tell these stories. Not just to remember remarkable people, but to ask the harder questions. What does courage actually cost? What do we do with truth once we've seen it? And how do we judge each other without knowing what someone has witnessed, survived, or buried? Lee Miller kept her eyes open when the world was on fire, and then she carried the smoke inside her for the rest of her life. Her son found the evidence after she was gone. He spent decades sharing her work, ensuring the world finally saw what she had seen. That is the final vindication. The truth she couldn't speak is now being seen by millions. So as you go about your week, look a little closer at the people around you. We are all walking around with chapters of our story that no one else has read. If you see someone who seems difficult, broken, or lost, ask yourself, what might they be carrying that I can't see? What do you think it truly means to witness something? And do you think we judge difficult people too harshly without knowing their history? Let me know in the comments. If this is your first time here, I'm Steve, and this is Voices Beyond Boundaries. I tell stories about courage, character, and the invisible things that shape who we become. This is my second mini documentary. My first was about Nirja Banat, a flight attendant who gave her life to save hundreds on a hijacked plane. If you haven't seen that one, it's worth your time. It explores a very different kind of courage. I've got more stories coming. People who faced impossible moments and showed us what humans are capable of, both the best and the worst. Subscribe and hit the bell if you don't want to miss them. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who has been judged unfairly, or someone who might see themselves in Lee Miller's story, share this with them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.